In Walmart's Who Newville, everyone ready their cart. Amazing Black Friday deals are about to start. Online and in the app, such great deals to explore. Everything you love from tech, toys, and more. The days to save and the ones to remember. It's only the 25th to the 30th of November. Set your alarms. Don't miss out. These deals are epic, without a doubt. The Who's are all ready, but are you? Walmart Black Friday deals await. Who knew?
Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku. And it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
When the Communist Party ideology was stripped away suddenly and even traumatically for some people when the dissolution of the Soviet Union occurred, that left the officers without that coalescing ideology, that there was nothing for them left really to fight for. They saw the Russian government as being divided, fraught with indirection, and increasingly corrupt, starting from that corrupt point of the Communist Party, the Soviet era, and growing from there. And the officers in the State Security Service, the FSB and its predecessors, had nothing to hold them back from joining that.
Welcome to the Spy Masters podcast. I'm your host, Antonia Senior. I'm a writer and journalist, an enthusiast for spy stories, facts and fiction, historical and contemporary. Every fortnight, I bring you the best writers on all aspects of intelligence, from David McCluskey to David Petraeus. Subscribe, follow us, tell your friends. Help us keep bringing you fascinating interviews with brilliant writers. Our guest this time is Dr. Kevin Riehle. He retired in 2021 from a 30-year career in US intelligence, where he focused on analysing foreign intelligence services and supporting counterintelligence activities. He's currently at Brunel University. We're here to talk about his latest book, The Russian FSB, A Concise History of the Federal Security Service. It's from a new series of concise histories of intelligence from Georgetown University Press, which is well worth checking out. There are books on the intelligence services of Iran and Pakistan and more planned. But today, it's all about Russia. What makes the FSB a uniquely Russian intelligence service? How much continuity is there with the feared KGB? What is the FSB's relationship to President Putin? We talk about all of this and more. So I'll hand you over to me, talking to Kevin Riehle about the FSB. Kevin, thank you so much for coming on the Spy Masters podcast. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
So the book we're here to talk about today is your latest tome, which is about the Russian FSB, and it's a concise history of Russia's Federal Security Service. And I'm very looking forward to getting into the meat of it with you. But before we start, could you just tell us a little bit about how you came to be writing books like this, a little bit about your background? Because as I understand it, you're not a long-time academic. You've had a slightly more, shall we say, exciting career than that.
Exciting might be an exaggeration. A practitioner might be better. I spent about 30 years in the U.S. government as a counterintelligence analyst. And in that time, I focused efforts on a variety of targets, of threats to national security. I looked some at Russia, but also at other things over the course of those years. But academically, I focused primarily on Russia. My undergraduate degree was Russian and political science, and throughout my career, I've used the Russian language for various research purposes. And in the past, since I have retired from government just a few years ago in 2021, I have focused primarily on Russian intelligence and state security in my research. And so I published several books and articles about that topic. This book came up partially because there really wasn't anything quite like it in English. There's in Russian, there are a number of works available to discuss the FSB, although they tend to be patriotic and quite almost propagandistic in the way they approach the FSB. So when I was teaching at a previous university where I taught, a student wanted to write a master's dissertation on the internal security operations of the FSB. And there really wasn't a book available to direct her to in order to write on that. And if one doesn't read Russian, it's hard to find that material. So this book was somewhat drew from that there just needed to be something in a concise form to explain what the FSB is.
So I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, we could do it now actually about the sources, because you say in the book that actually that can be quite problematic because the sources are very partisan. Can you just talk a little bit about how you found the information necessary and how you sifted what was partisanship and what was fact?
Although I don't have an exact percentage, probably 80% of the sources in this book are in Russian. And that's because that's where most of the discussion of the FSB occurs. There's discussion in the West in English language materials of the FSB and in other languages, but it tends to be politicized and often hyperbolic. And in the Russian materials, it can be that way as well. Much of the Russian materials comes from two different camps. One from Russian government-sponsored publications, which give a certain perspective on the FSB as being the protector of Russia and of making sure that foreign threats don't harm Russia. And the other main camp is from oppositionist press, mostly located in the West, which describes the FSB as evil, corrupt, and out to get everyone. So somewhere in between those is what I had to navigate. And even amidst that somewhat politicized dialogue, whether either for or against the Russian regime, there are many data points that are valuable. And those data points are what I was attempting to derive from that material, regardless of the interpretation of them, so that I could then develop my own interpretation in a more objective and kind of centered approach. So the sources require some careful handling at times.
Yes, I can imagine. Did you find your background as an intelligence analyst as helpful as your academic background in sifting this stuff?
Absolutely. There's no question. I could not have done this without having seen a little bit of how intelligence services operate. I mean, I certainly have gained much from academic research as well, but the two, in my own approach to this, need to be combined because they allow me to see it from the perspective of reality, I guess. I mean, one of the concerns about journalists' portrayals of these materials sometimes is they don't necessarily look at it in a realistic way. They look at it in a way that will attract readers and sell newspapers, but not necessarily in an objective way. So my practitioner background, in addition to the academic study, has allowed me to be more objective about it.
Brilliant. Well, look, let's get into the meat of it. Just for the beginners start here, could you just briefly say what the FSB is, and then we'll after that we'll get into the history, but what's the current position of the FSB and what's the best way of describing its position in Russian society?
The FSB is Russia's primary internal security service. It has a spectrum of powers, from law enforcement to intelligence to border security, and those powers are focused on protecting the regime in Russia. Because it has that whole spectrum of powers, it is a very powerful organization. And it has the ability to minimize threats to the regime that may come from either inside or outside Russia. And consequently, within Russia, It is a well-known organization, and it publicizes itself that openly for that purpose, so that it can hold that position of being the protector of Russia. And sometimes in the West, we see the FSB as an organization that manipulates information abroad and things like that. But in all of its activities, it should be interpreted as an internal security service, and even those external activities are a fit within that internal security service mission.
So for British listeners, it's a sort of equivalence between FSB as kind of MI5, but with wider powers, and the SVR is the equivalent of MI6 in the sense that it's the outward-looking organisation. Is that
in a very rough sense? The SVR is closer to an equivalent of MI6, but the SVR also has parts of what would in the British system would be under GCHQ. But the FSB has powers that are well beyond the MI5. MI5 is a security service that has investigative powers, which the FSB does have. But the FSB also has powers that look like MI6, collecting intelligence abroad. It also has powers that look like the Home Office with border security responsibilities, and it also has powers that look like portions of the Special Operations Forces, because it has a Special Operations responsibility. In the U.S. sense, and in the book, I actually kind of make a list of this from a U.S. perspective, because that's where my interpretation mostly comes from, although it can probably be translated into other states. It includes portions of the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It has counterintelligence responsibilities that fall across those organizations. It has even to the point of being the investigative arm for securities and investment fraud, as well as environmental fraud or damage. So it has powers that aren't really equivalent to any one organization in the West. In fact, there's no organization in the West, no Western democratic state that would place as much power into a single organization as Russia has placed in the FSB. So it has some of those equivalencies, but it's much more than that.
It's so fascinating, and it's clearly a sort of function of how it emerged and its history. And one of the things that I was really interested in your book is that sense of continuity with the KGB, and actually, fascinatingly, I had no idea that it has a sort of self-identification with even pre-revolutionary intelligence services. So let's start with a kind of dissolution of the KGB in 1991, and then if you could just sort of give a broad sketch of then how the FSB kind of grows out of the political tumult that follows that.
The FSB initially, the FSB came into existence in 1995, and for about a 4-year period, there was upheaval in Soviet and then early post-Soviet state security. There were multiple name changes, resubordinations, reorganization of missions, and the initial hope within many people in Russia was that Russia would do away with the KGB-like entity altogether, that they would just basically scrap it and start from the foundation again, like countries in Eastern and Central Europe did, like the Czech Republic, like the Baltic states, like Poland, where they just removed the old organization and started from scratch. In the Russian system, the leaders of Russian state security were actually proud of the fact that they did not do that. They considered that a mistake on the part of those Eastern and Central European states, because those states were, for a period of time, weakened by the necessity of starting from scratch, and Russia didn't feel that was a good course. Initially, the what was the KGB broke up into three organizations. One was the SVR, which was the Foreign Intelligence Collection arm, and that has remained consistent as an organization since 1991, when it was first created. Another organization was responsible essentially directly to the president. It was initially called the Main Directorate of Protection, later called the Federal Protection Organization, as it's now called. And it was responsible for directly protecting the president, both physically from potential physical attacks and politically from opposition and from political risks in the country. And then the third took control of all the rest of the old KGB missions, the counterintelligence, the internal security, law enforcement, and all the things that had been part of the KGB, except those somewhat fringe responsibilities, remained with something called the Ministry of Security. But a lot of people in Russia thought, were complaining that wasn't enough. That wasn't reform enough. It's really just the same old KGB as it was. So we need to break it up even further. And over the next several years, those functions did break up somewhat further to create two new organizations, one called the Federal Border Service, which took all of the border guards, and the other called the Federal Agency for Government Communications and Information, or FAPSI, in its Russian acronym. And it took essentially signals intelligence and information security. And that still left all the rest of the functions, particularly counterintelligence and internal security, with series of reorganizations until it became known as the FSB. A new director of the FSB was appointed in 1998. A relatively unknown individual at the time named Vladimir Putin, who saw the internal rivalries, the budget crunches, the inefficiencies of having those multiple organizations. Now, while the reformists wanted it that way because they did not want a perfectly efficient internal security service, because perfectly efficient internal security leads to some internal repression. But Putin viewed that as a disadvantage. And he then became the prime minister in 1999, and then the acting president, and finally elected president early 2000. And over the next several years, he began to rebuild the four pieces of the KGB that had been broken off. And so the Federal Border Service and the FAPSI in particular were reintegrated in most part back into the FSB. So the FSB today looks a lot like that Ministry of Security did in the immediate post-Soviet era. Now, you mentioned the Tsarist era. One thing that was taboo to discuss during the Soviet era, and one discontinuity with the FSB from its Soviet predecessor, is its overt identification with the pre-Bolshevik era, openly talking about the values of Tsarist era security officers, openly writing articles publishing articles in FSB publications, holding these Tsarist era officers up as points of emulation. During the Soviet era, that never would have happened. That was, the pre-Bolshevik era was what the Communist Party of the Soviet Union swept away. It was the purpose for which the Bolshevik Revolution was fought. So it was never openly discussed, but that's very quickly began to be discussed in the post-Soviet era, and now is quite open.
We need to talk about ideology and where that's consistent, where it's changed. But you talk about a kind of view within Russia, which is Putin's view, but it's also more widely held, that a strong state needs a strong security service, yes, right? And that's a specifically Russian strong state, which feeds into his sort of, Russian nationalism and the patriotism angle, which takes you back pre-Bolshevism to a kind of continuity that says Russia is exceptional, Russia is large, there are centrifugal forces at work which pull away from the center, and in order to create a strong and robust Russia, we need a strong and robust security service. So it all feeds in, presumably.
Absolutely. And it is a culture that Russians don't necessarily object to. And I don't want to, many people have criticized Russians for that aspect, that they don't object to their system, they don't rise up against it. But it is just the Russian approach to a state. And a strong state is a necessity for Russia to, in the minds of Russians, to resist the external invasions that have occurred on multiple occasions over history. And the Russians remember that. That is part of their conscious memory, this sense of external threat all the time. And that external threat is always connected to the inside, to attempts to destroy Russia from the inside, to degrade Russian morals, and to degrade Russia's state cohesiveness. And Russians view that as a necessity, that they must protect against that. I would caution against the word nationalistic, though, because Russians, or the Russian Federation, is not a single ethnic nationality. It is made up of over 100 ethnic groups, Russians being obviously the predominant one, but many others as well. And in the Russian language, there are actually two words for Russian. One is Ruski, which means Russian ethnic. The other is Rossiyskiy, which means Russian state, Russian statehood. And when Russians tend to describe the Russian government leaders, anyway, when they describe that Russianness, they use the word that refers to Russian statehood, not to Russian nationality, because they have to be careful. They don't want to exclude all of the peoples of the Caucasus, for example. They don't want to exclude all the peoples of Siberia who are not Russian. They have to keep that in mind. So nationalism in Russia is more a tool than it is a founding ideology. Russians, there are many nationalists in Russia, and many people who are quite xenophobic, but the Russian government tends to be inclusive of whoever views themselves as part of the Russian state, not just those who are Russian ethnic. So, and it has to do that in order to rule. So the word nationalism is thrown around a lot about Russia, but Russians are much more nuanced about that than we tend to think about it.
So is patriotism a better word? Because that could embrace that wider.
It probably is, yes, because patriotism looks at the regime and the protecting that regime and defending it from external forces that are not Russian, Rossiyskiy. And so, yes, patriotism is probably a better word for it.
Just to circle back to that sense of the Russians themselves accepting in a way that I suspect in Britain and America and other places we wouldn't be so accepting of the proposition in the first place that you should have a strong state security service. It would be anathema to us. But it must be quite easy, if you're Russian, to look at that period in the early 90s where there wasn't a strong state security service, and there was also chaos and hunger and fear. Cause and effect is kind of difficult to kind of extrapolate from that, but you can see why you would look at that and think, well, that's not great either.
There are many Russians today who look back at that period and said, we tried this Western liberalist democracy thing and it failed. So it's not for us. We are going to go with a strong state, a statist system, because that is how we will protect ourselves from these external invaders. That's a concept that is repeated often in Russia. And as I point out in the book, most of the leaders of the FSB today lived through that chaos of the 1990s. And they lived at that time when Russia was politically, militarily, and economically weak. When the Yeltsin government actually had to fire tank rounds or felt it had, to fire tank rounds on the Parliament building in 1993 to bring the Parliament into line, that a new constitution was brought into existence in the mid-1990s. The constitution under which Vladimir Putin operates today, by the way, that called for a strong president and a weaker legislature, because a strong hand needed to rule Russia during that time of chaos. And Putin, who was in a mid-level bureaucratic role at the time, learned from that, as did many of the FSB leaders today. And they lived during that time, and they now see that as a time to very actively avoid, to prevent Russia from ever being weak like that again. And a strong state security service is an essential element in that mission.
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans. Even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes. Now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox. Clean feels good.
Although that 90s period also threw up a kind of a different strand, because when you're trying to, in the book, identify the ideological basis of the current FSB, I mean, obviously the ideological basis of the KGB is much easier to kind of tease out, but the ideological basis of the FSB, you kind of describe it as a sort of mix of patriotism and then what you call a kind of lingering Soviet Chekist mindset. You throw into that mix the tolerating of 90s self-interest. So those three things kind of as a melange which kind of characterizes the ideological basis of the FSB.
During the Soviet era, the ideology was a complete driver. The KGB was responsible for protecting the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And that was a coalescing mission, coalescing driver for KGB activities. The KGB had a reputation, anyway, of not being corrupt. Now, certainly it doesn't mean there was no such thing as a corrupt KGB officer, but in the highly corrupted system of the Soviet Communist Party, where self-interest was the norm, the KGB stood out somewhat as being a relatively clean organization that was there to protect the party. When the Communist Party ideology was stripped away suddenly and even traumatically for some people when the dissolution of the Soviet Union occurred, that left the officers without that coalescing ideology, that there was nothing for them left really to fight for. They saw the Russian government as being divided, fraught with indirection, and increasingly corrupt, starting from that corrupt point of the Communist Party of the Soviet era and growing from there. And the officers in the State Security Service, the FSB and its predecessors, had nothing to hold them back from joining that. And there were even periods of time when FSB officers weren't paid for a few months at a time. So they had to think of their own survival, their own interests. And without that Communist Party ideology that brought them together for a common interest, they were left to their own. And that was the foundation of the reputation the FSB now has in the Russian system of being a corrupt organization. There are certain elements of the FSB that are responsible for, like, for example, maintaining economic security. And in the process of conducting those economic security operations, they have access to large amounts of money through banking regulations, through investigations of fraud. And in the process of those particular investigations, as well as others, it's a real tempting prospect to use their investigative knowledge, their access, and the fear that is associated with the FSB continuing in post-Soviet Russia. They can use that to their advantage, where they can negotiate essentially with criminals and say, you can continue your criminal activity as long as you give us a cut. And there's nothing stopping them from doing that. This idea of patriotism, which has become a much more overt, much louder ideology in the past 20 years than it had been in the 1990s, is an attempt to give them an ideology that to rein in that self-interest. But that has only worked to a certain extent, and there have been some significant and public criminal investigations involving FSB officers themselves that have really tainted the reputation of the FSB amongst the Russian people. So that stripping off of an ideology and leaving it with something that is only partially an ideology really has led to that self-interest.
Yeah, you talk about that lack of ideology removing any inhibitions, and then the examples that you give of the cases where they have been some senior FSB officers have been publicly kind of castigated or tried for it. I mean, the money involved is staggering. And then you say at one point that promotion is desperately prized amongst FSB officers because the higher you climb the ladder, the more lucrative your opportunities for self-enrichment are.
Absolutely. The large amounts of money really are particularly focused on banking regulations and like real estate investments, where large amounts of money are involved. Also, occasionally defense investments, although defense investments are more risky because Putin actually himself published an article or under his name a decade or so ago in which he said that defense corruption is treason. And so defense corruption is a little more risky than banking corruption is, but it still happens because criminals go where the money is, and if you have someone who has access to banking regulatory investigations and can see how banks are skirting those regulations in order to reduce their investment risks themselves, those FSB investigators can use that to their advantage. And sometimes there's huge amounts of money involved. And that's just the higher, as you point out, the higher you go, the more access you have to that. So that's a tempting prospect for an FSB officer.
But doesn't anti-corruption just become another political tool? Because if everybody's corrupt, if you want to take someone out, you can always find evidence that they've, taken backhanders. So, even the anti-corruption becomes another form of corruption, doesn't it?
Corruption in the Russian system is defined a bit differently than we would define corruption. Corruption in Russia means that you are using your position for self-interest, for accumulating money for yourself, and you are using that power and money against the Soviet system. I'm sorry, against the Russian system, excuse me. However, if you accumulate money and power into yourself and you use it in support of the Russian system, that's not corruption. That's just the benefit of doing business with the center meaning the Putin administration. So though there are many people surrounding Putin who have accumulated huge amounts of money, and they have massive villas on the coast of Spain, and they have yachts that we've seen a lot of discussion of since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That's because they were just gaining the benefit of being loyal to the Russian system. They were part of the system, and that system allowed them to enrich themselves. But those who made the mistake of enriching themselves, but then speaking out against the system, lost everything they had.
When you say the system, what you really mean is Putin, though, right?
Yes, Putin as a central figure, and Putin is the grantor of those benefits. Yes, and his inner circle. I mean, it's Putin personally, but also several people that are strong in his inner circle who also are part of that central system, that administration. So yes, it is a system that is focused on Putin, with varying concentric circles surrounding him that have varying levels of power, or reduced levels of power the further you are away from him. But the closer you get, and means the more loyal you are, and the more financial benefit there is to it.
I find it extraordinary that reading your book, I kind of felt almost nostalgic for the KGB. But one of the can we just circle it back a little bit, because I really want to talk about this notion that you have, that they also have a kind of continuity around this idea of a Chekist mindset.
When the first Soviet state security, Bolshevik era state security service was created, it was called, this acronym was the VCK, or the All-Union Extraordinary Commission to Combat Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. Long name. It was acronymized to Cheka. And that acronym, the organizational name itself, was actually retired in 1921, so that name Cheka went away in 1921. But the honorific Chekist has continued since then. And amongst Russian and Soviet and now Russian state security officers, to be a Chekist is an honorable label to assume. That Chekist, though, is a combination of a couple of things. It itself is a driving philosophy behind state security in Russia. A Chekist mindset essentially means that you're always looking for threats. And threats emanate from both the inside and the outside of Russia. The inside, the threats emanate from the Russian people themselves. Any potential manifestation of opposition within Russia is viewed as a threat, because it counters that idea of a strong state, and it counters the impression that the strong state tries to present of being unified. And in that statist system, unity means strength. And any manifestation of disunity means weakness. And so to be strong, you have to be unified. So opposition is a threat to that statist Putin-esque regime. But the other threat emanates from the outside. And there's always an assumption within the Russian security system that Russia is under siege from outside forces. Today, in the Russian dialogue, you hear the discussion of NATO and the United States and the UK as being these boogeymen of trying to tear down Russia. But during the Cold War, it was a similar group, particularly the United States as the Главный противник, or the main enemy. And there was just an assumption that that external enemy was always there and trying to tear down the Russian system. But where the Chekist mindset comes in is the assumption that those two threats are invariably connected to each other. Any manifestation of opposition inside Russia is interpreted as always having an external hand behind it. the Russian people in this statist mindset don't have the agency to do that themselves. It must have an external hand. And you'll see that in discussions of people like Alexei Navalny, who was called a puppet of Western special services, or the concept of the foreign agent, of designating various organizations as foreign agents, because if they speak out against the Russian regime, they must be foreign agents. They, by definition, must have a foreign connection. But then on the other side, the external threat is always, in this Chekist mindset, trying to disintegrate Russia from the inside, to use this opposition to destroy Russian morals, to destroy Russia's cohesiveness, its unity, to break it up into pieces, and to destroy that statehood that Russia prides itself in so much. So the two are always connected to each other. And that began in that early Cheka period, when there was actually some connection of Western powers to internal opposition, although not completely, not universally. And through the Stalin era, when Stalin identified all of anyone who even hinted at a negative comment to Stalin was called an enemy of the people and was often prosecuted for espionage, which means connections to a foreign special service. And then during the Soviet era, that became the normal expectation, is that there's always this connection between external and internal threats. That remains today. And as I mentioned, you see that in institutions like the foreign agents designations, like the description of Alexei Navalny as a foreign puppet, things like that. And those, consequently, FSB sees itself as always protecting against both the external and the internal.
So interesting. I went to a talk by an expert on the KGB called Amir Viner at Stanford, where he talked about the KGB having an image of themselves as a kind of knightly caste that was, protecting the Soviet Union, and an idea of them as being moral champions as well. Does the FSB have any lingering elements of that, or is the sort of more self-interested, corrupted side of it make it too difficult to kind of claim that moral high ground?
The FSB very much continues to have that, to portray itself in that way. You'll see all around the borders of Russia, for example, statues and monuments to FSB border guards. They are the honored protectors of the Russian state from the evil outside, from the outside influences that are trying to disintegrate us. And all around the borders, you'll see there are prominent memorials to monuments to the border guards. That's just one aspect. But the FSB itself actually holds competitions to honor those who perpetuate that view of the knightly caste, of the FSB as being the protector of the state against the evil outside, with books and songs and monuments and poetry and movies, all being honored when they perpetuate that image. That is often the discussions within the FSB, or the FSB's discussions openly, when it discusses itself within the Russian population, it honors its people publicly. There is no country in the world, I think, that I have seen that publicly honors its intelligence and security officers as much as Russia does, with monuments, with postage stamps, with holidays, with speeches, and with school events, and with everything that inculcates that view into the Russian population. There's no state that does that as much as Russia does. I have on my office wall hanging collections of postage stamps, all of which commemorate Russian security intelligence officers. And there are dozens. And if you think of a British or an American context, can you think of a postage stamp that honors an intelligence or security officer?
Well, I think the Russians did one of Kim Philby, so they did one of ours.
They did one of Kim Philby, that's correct, and they did some Americans as well. And they all made postage stamps against Soviet intelligence officers who operated against the Americans and the British over the years too. That is what they're proud of. And that is the impression that the FSB wants the Russian people to have. And they do everything they can to counter that impression of corruption by just disseminating this idea of the FSB as a patriotic protector.
Isn't there like a Czechist day, like in December? It's a national holiday called Czechist.
It's not a national holiday necessarily. It's not like when the whole country has the day off, but it is the 7th of December the 20th of December, when all of the people who have any connection to state security, whether it's current serving state security personnel or veterans or families, hold memorial events, and they hold veterans honorariums, and they have speeches, and the senior leaders write articles to the Russian people reminding them how great the FSB and its predecessors are. In usually the early part of a calendar year, February or March, Putin stands before the FSB and gives a speech every year. And that speech is quite consistent, where he just essentially lists down the different elements of the FSB, the border guards, the military counterintelligence, the broader counterintelligence, all the different aspects of the FSB, and praises them for how well they're acting, and then gives them their marching orders for the coming year, sort of thing. And those speeches are publicly available to the Russian people and are often repeated in Russian press. And so, yes, it is something that Russia celebrates, not just on that Czechist Day or that day of that State Security Workers' Day, as it's officially called, but all year round. And the president is a major patron of that.
You make the point in the book, though, that it's very hard to work out from the outside, or probably from the inside, how far that kind of relentless campaign to make the FSB the centre of things, how far that actually resonates with the Russian people, and how far the corruption stories have kind of overtaken that view. And it's quite hard to unpick actually where the FSB stands in Russian opinion.
It is. And part of the reason is because there have been some of those corruption stories that have gained a lot of traction. Before his death, Alexei Navalny published a number of videos, several of which pointed directly toward the corruption, not just of the Russian administration, but of Vladimir Putin personally. And the video published in just before Alexei Navalny was arrested, that was released, gained tens of millions of watchers. And it was originally released only in Russian, which meant that many of those watchers were inside Russia. When Alexei Navalny's funeral was televised, or was broadcast live on the internet earlier this year, there were Russians all over the country who were in the chat, that live video feed, were expressing their condolences and then listing which cities they were in. We're in Kalugin, in Pskov, in Yekaterinburg, all over the country. They list where they were. And that list represented pretty much the whole of Russia by the time it was done. And so that honor toward someone who's fighting against that corrupt regime is pretty broad in the Russian system today. But the Russians know that they have to express that very carefully because the FSB is there to prevent it from gaining any traction.
Can I just ask on that point, how far is the FSB allowed to go in its powers over ordinary people in Russia? I mean, what can it do to you if you are? I mean, obviously we've seen, what happens to Navalny, but like if you're just an ordinary dissenting Russian, what's the possibility for you?
There are several levels of reaction. The first level might just be monitoring activities through communications monitoring or by recruiting someone around a suspected individual through human recruitment and watching just to make sure that it doesn't get out of hand. The next level might be actually approaching an individual and doing what's called in Russia a prophylactic interview, which essentially means an FSB officer walks up to an individual and says, we know what you're doing, knock it off, because it could get a lot worse for you. So we advise you to stop. And those prophylactic interviews can be very effective because the FSB carries a heavy dose of fear amongst the Russian population. And so if an FSB officer flashes his badge and walks up to you and tells you to stop something, then a lot of people are inclined to obey that. The next level is to actually jail someone for a short time, particularly those who participate in demonstrations or actively communicate online. And that might be similar to that prophylactic interview, basically to give you a sense of what could happen to you if you didn't step down, if you didn't back down. But the higher you go in the organization of anti-Russian discussion, anti-Russian actions, the more severe the potential reaction will be, to the level of with Navalny and other people over the years who have actually been removed physically through assassination or through arrest, through long-term arrest, and because of that then becomes a symbol for the Russian people. See what happens when you get to this level of opposition. This is what you have in store for you if you dare to do this. And in some cases, those people are exiled. There are a number of prominent exiled Russians today, some of who were those rich oligarchs of the 1990s and early 2000s who did use their riches against the new Putin regime and are now outside Russia having to look in. There's that kind of spectrum of activities really depend, or of FSB response is basically dependent upon how far the oppositionist activity has matured in organizing and representing something. If you become a symbol of the opposition that is publicly known in Russia, then you can expect to be handled quite severely.
The system has set itself up that it has to handle the symbolic opposition very severely, because otherwise the prophylactic measures at a small level don't work. Nothing works. It only works with fear. Without fear, the system doesn't work.
The system is based upon fear. You're absolutely right. And that fear is mixed with the Chekist mindset, which says that you realize we have to do this. We have to be this severe, because if we're not, the outside will destroy us. And that Chekist mindset advances that idea that we have to use these suppressive measures to protect you from that evil outside. And so many people buy onto that. And there are many people who are not opposed to that within the Russian system. They actually see that in the way that it is portrayed. But others just keep them, or the self-censor essentially, because they know if they say anything out of line that they're going to start stepping up that spectrum of FSB responses. And so both a mix of fear and patriotism, bit of a carrot and stick approach, is how the Russian government is trying to keep that center strong.
As you say in the book, the foremost mission of the FSB is to protect the ruling Russian regime. So then, of course, the big, unanswered, massive, obvious question is, it's a regime which doesn't have its own succession baked in. So how does that work? What does that look like? And where does that leave the SFB?
The FSB right now benefits greatly from its closeness organizationally, and even in the closeness of the senior personnel to Putin himself. The director of the FSB, Bartnikov, is a longtime friend of Putin from the old St. Petersburg days. Several of the senior leaders within the FSB today come from that St. Petersburg circle. And so when that element goes away, the FSB will have a couple of choices. It will either find someone else, another circle to coalesce around, or it may find itself outside of that, so whatever the following, the succeeding circle is. Putin is in good health today. He's 72 years old. He's not likely to die tomorrow. However, he will die one day, and he's getting old, and he's not going to last forever. And many of the senior FSB leaders are of a similar generation as he is. Began their KGB careers in the mid-1970s or even earlier than that. They're in their 70s, and they just won't be around for forever. There are younger FSB officers in their 50s and 60s who could take their mantle and could pick up a similar methodology, a similar mindset as has been carried out since the post-Soviet era. But there really is not yet a post-Soviet leadership in the Russian FSB. And that will be a significant change when those individuals who began their careers in the Soviet era are all gone. The FSB leadership will have to make a decision. Do we continue on this same fear-based system, or is that actually a detriment to us? Or is the FSB actually the right organization to lead Russia? There are others who are strong. There have power. There are some from the Ministry of Defense. There are some from businesses that are close to Putin. If Putin were to die tomorrow, just in a hypothetical sense, I can see Russia looking a bit like what the Soviet Union did in 1953, when Stalin died suddenly. And there was no one point that that took the leadership role as the successor. One person tried to. That was Lavrentiy Beria. And he was the basically leader of state security. But in 1953, other power centers, military party at the time, removed him pretty quickly because they were afraid of the director of the state security being in charge, because he had all the goods on everyone and he could remove whoever he wanted. And so I can see it looking somewhat like that, where an FSB senior might assume that role, but that fear would drive other parties in the system to do something about that.
I guess the main difference, though, between now and 1953 is that then there was another structural organisation that had clout, which was the party itself. Whereas, there's no sort of equivalent to the party now. There's Putin and his cronies, but without Putin, what is, that's...
And those cronies really have gained their power because of their closeness to Putin. And without that central Putin being there, they would fight against each other. Mm. It would be a wolf fight, waiting to see who comes out on top. And it could be a chaotic time for Russia because there is no designated successor, and no autocratic leader ever designates a successor. That's a dangerous thing for an autocratic leader to do, because that means you are admitting that one day you'll leave and that you're not indispensable. Putin is still indispensable today, according to the Russian system. That means he cannot designate a successor. But that also means that when he does leave, or at some point he'll die, those people who are only held at bay against each other because of their loyalty to Putin will then go after each other.
It's going to be extraordinary times.
It will be, yes.
Kevin, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. What a brilliant overview of an organisation that I think, as you rightly said, doesn't always get sort of dispassionate attention from the West.
Thank you for insightful questions, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow, tweet, spread the word so that we can keep bringing you more brilliant writers talking about spies. Don't miss an episode of the Spy Masters podcast.